Welcome back to part 3 of our stained glass bat series. If you haven't seen parts 1 and 2 yet, you can find those links in the description below. Now, if you did watch part 1 and 2 when they were released, you will know that there's been a bit of a time lag since I released those videos and part 3, for which I do apologize. I've been dealing with some health issues over the last number of months, and I'm just back on my feet now and able to tackle this project. So all of this was recorded back in September, October of last year. And so I'm just going to be doing a voiceover to explain to you the process I used while I was creating this bat. So we left off the last video, part 2, where we had baked the paint onto the glass. And you saw me put the glass into the little oven and turn it on. So basically after that, once the timer went off for that paint to cure, I left the glass in the oven and I turned the oven off. And that's to allow the glass to cool back down to room temperature very slowly. Otherwise, there is a chance of thermal shock, and if you open the door to the oven, you may allow cooler air in and it could break the glass. So it's best to just leave everything closed up, turn the oven off, let it cool down to room temperature. So now we're at the foiling stage. So you can actually see in the layout that I have on the table with the bat that I don't actually have that part of the wing that has the paint on it. And that's because that's actually at this very moment at the time of recording, it's in the oven baking. So to do my foiling for my projects, for the most part, I tend to use a 7/32 width foil. The only brand of foil that I use is Edco for the regular straight foils. And that's just because it's my favorite brand. It wraps really nicely. It is thick enough, but thin enough to be pliable, but hold up to burnishing. It sticks really well. And I find that the foil is soft enough to actually sort of mold it around all of some of the more intricate shapes that I might cut for some stained glass projects. And it will do that and mold around those areas without tearing. So that's why I really like this brand. So you can see I'm just using a flat fid, and I don't use scissors. I know a lot of people like to use scissors to clip their foil when they're done wrapping it. But for me, I find that having scissors, it's a little bit more of a process because you have to pick them up and get your hands lined up properly. But the thing I hate most about using scissors to cut my foil is that they get really gummy over time, and they can be a real challenge to clean and get that stickiness off of them. So I don't tend to use scissors. I'll just use a little knife, and when the blade isn't sharp enough to cut, or maybe it does get a little bit sticky, although I've never had to dispose of one because it's sticky, with these knives you can just break the bit of the blade off using a pair of pliers and start on a new fresh piece of blade, which is nice and sharp and cuts perfectly through the foil. Now, you don't have to use an actual fid like what I have here. This is a flat piece of plastic, and it's a tool that's made for this purpose, and it's called a fid, F-I-D. And you could very well use the handle part of a marker. You could use a popsicle stick. You could use a wooden dowel. It depends on what you like. And for me, I got comfortable using these plastic fids. And I do much prefer the older ones to the newer ones. The new ones seem to be a very hard plastic, where the older ones are a softer plastic, and the resistance it gives when you're burnishing the foil down flat to the glass is very different between the two, and I much prefer the older one. But you can really use whatever sort of tool or gadget or whatever you have on hand to do this part of the process. Now you'll see too, when I'm wrapping the foil around the glass, just as soon as I'm done, I'll kind of run my fingers around the edges, and I do that before I actually crimp the edges down. And that's simply so that I can make sure that right here, you saw I just ran my fingers down the sides, and that's just to make sure that the edges are, the outer edge of the glass, that foil is stuck to it before I start crimping the edges so that it doesn't shift. Then I crimp the edges down, and then using the fid, work on the edges first. Again, make sure that there's no crinkles along that outer edge and that it's stuck down really well before moving on to the front and back edges for burnishing. And so that's the process that I use. I'm going to let you watch the whole process, but I'm not going to do it real time. So here we can see I've sped this up, and I'm not going to do a voiceover for this whole section because it's all going to be very repetitive. So I'll go ahead and let you watch through this part, and I'll rejoin you when we start soldering. With the foiling done, we can now move on to soldering. And so you can see me here getting my brush dipped in a little bit of flux. I'm not using too much. Now, I am very carefully just applying a tiny bit of flux to some of the joints that I can use to kind of hold the whole project together by tacking it with a little bit of solder. And this is because I was too lazy to use some push pins around the edges to kind of hold everything in place. And because I had already so diligently laid it all out, I didn't want to disturb anything. So I'm just using this method for this particular project. I do this sometimes I don't. Sometimes I take the time to pull out some pins and put them into the cork that I use. But today I'm just doing a little bit of tacking here with solder on this particular one. So I applied just a light amount of flux just at those key points where all the pieces kind of intersect. And so by doing this, adding just a tiny touch of solder, it's gonna basically glue it together so that the whole project is one piece and I don't have to worry about anything shifting at the last second. I don't worry about them being super pretty. At this point, it's really just a matter of being something functional that is tacking it all together. So I've obviously sped up the video here, but now that everything has been tacked together, I can go ahead and add flux to the whole project. And you'll see that I only do it on the side that's face up. Some people do pick up each individual piece and paint all the way around each piece. That's fine, you can do it that way. I do find that a much lengthier process to do it, but it does work. And the key is to get the flux on there so that you can start soldering. And so now it's just to solder everything together. I kind of float around the project and work on different areas that I want to, that seem to be instinctively the next part for me. And I kind of work around the edges and on the seams all mixed together. So sometimes I will go ahead and work on all the seams first and then do the tinning around the edges. But for the most part, I just kind of float around the project and enjoy the process and make sure that I've got it all done in the end. For soldering, I'm using a 60-40 solder. This is a gel or liquid flux, I don't recall exactly. And for the iron itself, I'm using a Hakko FX601, which is, as many of you know, my go-to and favorite iron. Now, the nice thing about the Hakko is that it has a temperature adjustment gauge on the iron itself. So you can control how much heat is being output in the tip. And so usually when I'm soldering, I'm working at about a 360 to a 410 temperature. And that will depend on the room temperature, what I'm working on, how big it is, how much I might have already heated it by working on different sections with solder, all that kind of stuff. That all kind of dictates, and as well, what you're doing. So what type of soldering technique you're using and things like that. All of those sorts of things go into determining the temperature that you're going to set the iron to. Now, having watched back the first side of the bat, I could see that it looks like I was struggling with a little bit of a low temperature. I probably should have turned the iron up a little bit. My guess is it was probably at 360 and should have been at 410. And the reason I know that is because when you saw me working in areas, there were times where I would get partway through reheating a seam that I already laid solder onto, and I get halfway through, and then all of a sudden my iron would kind of skip across the surface. And that's typically the response you'll get in the way things are working when your iron isn't quite hot enough. So I probably should have turned that up a little bit. Now, if you've really been paying attention here, you will have noticed that there is, at the top of the screen, there are two little glass globs. Now, those are going to be to make a spider. And although I was creating it at the same time as the bat so that I could do the process steps all at the same time, all the soldering was done together, all the grinding was done together, and so forth, the whole process for creating the spider will be shown in the next video, so in part 4 of this series. So now is a great time for me to mention that if you're enjoying this project or even the process that I use, please go ahead and hit subscribe and also hit that little bell notification icon. And that's so that whenever I release a new video, you'll be notified so that you don't miss anything. And so you'll get notified when the spider video comes out. All right, so with the soldering on side 2, you're going to notice that because the first side has been sealed with solder already, you've basically put a coating of solder on the bottom side of this now. When you put flux on the second side and you start to add your solder on the second side on top of that flux, sometimes the flux gets trapped a little bit in that seam, especially if you put way too much on. So you really want to be careful how much flux that you're adding to your project, but you can continue to heat it and you'll see little bubbles coming out. And all you need to do to take care of that is heat those bubbles until there are no more bubbles. And that means that all the flux will have evaporated and come out of that seam so that you don't end up leaving flux trapped inside there. So with side 1 and side 2 done, now we can work on the edges. Now, edge soldering can be a real challenge, and for anybody who's new, It is definitely going to be a little bit tricky on any areas that is curved. It's hard enough to just do a straight edge, but when you're dealing with curves, it can be even more tricky. So you're going to see the way that I do this is I kind of bounce around where I'm working. Again, I'm not really starting in one area and then making a continuous stream of solder all the way around the edge. I kind of bounce back and forth, and that's because you're constantly tipping and rotating the project to be able to line it up where you're going to put the solder. And so often what I'll do is if there are multiple areas that are on the same angle, I'll work on all of them at once instead of working, as I said, like a continuous stream all the way around the edge. Seeing as the video is sped up here and there's not a whole lot to say about soldering the outer edge, I'm going to let you go ahead and watch this and I'll rejoin you in a moment. All right, so with the outer edge completely finished, I'm going to go back and do any touch-ups that I want to do on the front and back of the project. I find that once you do the outer edge, wherever the solder seams touch the edge, there always seems to be a little bit of a hiccup there. So it's important to me anyway to go back and touch those up. Plus it gives you another chance to just kind of go over the whole project and make sure everything is exactly as you would like. So now we're ready to put hooks on our project. Now, because I'm going to have that little spider that dangles underneath the bat, I'm using just a tiny little ring. It's a little jump ring, and you can make one out of wire. It's just basically a tiny circle. And using my tiny pliers, I'm holding it up to that bottom edge of the seam so that I can attach it. And then very carefully, I'm going to go along and build up the edge up to that jump ring. And that'll help beef that up so that it has a little bit more support and will hold up over the long term. Now, just a little bit of foreshadowing here. You'll notice that I put that hook on the wing with no spider web because I thought it would look kind of neat to have the spider web on one side and the spider climbing the other side of the bat to make it look like it was a little bit more balanced. But yeah, well, we'll just leave that for now. So adding the wire hooks for the main part of the suncatcher to actually hang it in the window, I'm using some 18 gauge wire that I have pre-tinned, and I will pop a link up in the cards for you if you aren't sure how to tin copper wire. And so it's been pre-tinned and obviously fluxed at that point, and I'm just using my pliers and attaching it right into the seam on either side of the head. And I used lengthy pieces of wire because I wasn't sure how long I wanted these. So those are probably about 2 inches long. And now you see me kind of bending the wire up and forward, and that's just so that I can get in there with my pliers and cut it without breaking everything is the ideal way to do this. And so just doing the second one as well. And that's just so that they aren't super, super long hooks, and I could gauge how far into the seam I wanted to put them before I actually trimmed them off. So to complete these hooks, we then flip the project over to the back side and then bend the wire into place. And again, we're going to attach it right into that seam. And here you can see I'm pressing down with those little pliers. They're there so that when I heat that seam and the solder liquefies, I can push with the pliers, push that wire right down into the seam so that it gets buried. Now this one I've seen here that it's a little bit too long after I folded it down, so I'm going to trim it off a little bit more, push it down, and I'm going to repeat the process. So I'm just getting everything lined up, getting a good grip on the wire, heating up the seam, and then using the pliers to push down and hold the wire in place while the seam hardens again. And that's it for the hooks. So now it's time to clean the project, and to do this I use the classic NutriClean product, and you basically squirt that into a bucket of water, and the water is a little bit warm, and you can see it makes it kind of sudsy like soap. And I'm just going to use, in this video, I'm using a spongy cloth material. It's a disposable item like a sponge would be. But my sponges were all in tatters at the time. So I was using this to scrub it, and you basically want to remove any marker, any flux, everything that's on here. You want to get it perfectly clean. And that's so that over time you don't develop what we call white mold. Now white mold isn't really a mold as such, it's more of an oxidation process because the flux is still on the project, and it will create what looks like a whitish mold on your solder seams. So to avoid that, you want to make sure everything is perfectly clean. So do the front, the back, all of those edges, in all the little nooks and crannies, get it all perfectly clean. So once it's clean, before I apply patina, I like to dry it off. I find that patina applies a little bit better if you dry your project first. And so I'm going to patina the bat in a black patina, just because I want those solder seams to kind of disappear. And the black is a great way to do that. So with everything dry, we're ready to start adding patina. Now I'm adding a black patina to the bat because I want the solder seams to more or less disappear, and the black helps do that a lot more than leaving it silver, I should say. But if you would like some pointers and explanations on adding the black patina, I do have a video that is dedicated to that. And so if you click the link in the cards in the top right of your screen, you'll be able to go watch that video and get those tips and tricks. So while I finish adding patina, we're just going to speed through this, and I'll join you again in a moment. So for this project, I actually decided to try a different technique for cleaning it after the patina. I'm using plain water instead of using the bucket that has the cleaning product in it. And I can tell you, I will not do this again. I'd heard conflicting information about whether you should be using plain water or a cleaning product on top of the patina, because sometimes that could cause the patina to turn more of a brownish instead of a black. And so I thought I'd try it. As I said, I won't be doing it again because I have had over the last couple of months some of my solder seams starting to turn white. So now I get to clean those up and try again. So please go ahead and use the cleaning product to clean your projects after you've added patina. So that's it for this particular video. I will be coming back again with part 4 for this series, where we will be polishing the project. I decide to make a change about the black patina in one area, so we'll get into that. I decide on a couple other things and making a spider. So thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.